Pam Bondi stood poised at the podium of the congressional hearing room, her cream-colored suit striking against the rich mahogany walls. Her eyes remained steady as a sea of cameras captured the tension in real time. Moments earlier, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had thrown down a challenge. "The Pope's stance on immigration is crystal clear," she asserted. "Your policies run counter to his teachings and core Catholic values." The charge echoed through the chamber, stirring unease among committee members. Journalists leaned in, and millions tuned in online, anticipating a clash. But Bondi, the seasoned former Florida Attorney General with a reputation for sharp courtroom composure, didn't flinch. A faint, confident smile curved her lips as she reached for a leather portfolio, one whose contents were unknown to everyone in the room. Inside was something no one expected: private documentation of a personal meeting with Pope Francis himself, evidence that would upend the narrative in an instant. While AOC, bolstered by her massive online presence and progressive voice, believed she had put Bondi on the moral defensive, the truth was far more complicated. With first-hand insights and never-before-seen records, Bondi was prepared to flip the script. What unfolded next wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a moment of profound revelation, one that transcended partisanship and reached into the conscience of a divided nation. Before we dive into this remarkable moment, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that explore the intersection of faith, politics, and human connection, stories the mainstream media often overlooks. Inside hearing room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building, tension had been simmering all morning. What was expected to be a routine session of the House Oversight Committee on Immigration Policy had begun to take a different turn. The usual Washington buzz filled the room. Staffers murmured to lawmakers, journalists clattered away on keyboards, and camera crews fine-tuned their angles to catch every expression. At the center of it all sat Pam Bondi. The 56-year-old former Florida Attorney General, now serving as a special advisor on border issues, looked every bit the seasoned public figure. Her signature blonde hair and composed demeanor reflected her long-standing reputation, a no-nonsense prosecutor and unflinching conservative. Her appointment, however, had not come without controversy. Critics openly questioned her qualifications on immigration policy, despite her substantial legal credentials. Across from her sat the Democrats' rising star, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. At 34, AOC had become a household name, her journey from bartender to congresswoman capturing public imagination. Known for her viral committee performances and quick-fire dismantling of complex issues, she came prepared to create another headline moment. Leaning into her microphone, AOC addressed the witness with pointed precision. "Ms. Bondi, you've consistently referenced your Catholic faith as a guide for your approach to immigration. Yet Pope Francis has spoken clearly. He calls for compassion toward migrants and warns that building walls, not bridges, is unchristian. How do you reconcile your support for strict border policies with the teachings of your faith's highest spiritual authority?" This wasn't just a political question. It was deeply personal, and it set the stage for a confrontation that would echo far beyond the walls of Congress. Pam Bondi had often referenced her Catholic upbringing in interviews, recalling how the values taught by her Catholic school educators had deeply influenced her views on justice, service, and moral responsibility. So when Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez invoked Pope Francis in her line of questioning, it was a deliberate move, an attempt to highlight what she saw as a contradiction between Bondi's religious convictions and her stance on immigration. The cameras zoomed in, anticipating a typical defensive response, the kind often seen when public officials are forced to navigate the space between personal faith and political policy. A few Republican members of the committee shifted in their seats, sensing the setup. Chairman James Comer intervened. "The witness may respond. And I'd like to remind my colleagues that applying a religious test in these proceedings is not appropriate." Bondi took a calm sip of water, her face composed, betraying none of the pressure in the room. Everyone understood the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about immigration anymore, it was about integrity. Could a conservative Catholic genuinely claim alignment with both their faith and their political ideology? What no one in the room knew, not the committee members, not the press, not even her own staff, was that 3 months earlier, Bondi had quietly taken part in a private, unpublicized meeting with Pope Francis at the Vatican. The encounter, kept confidential at the Pope's own request, had left a lasting impact on her understanding of the immigration issue and revealed layers to the Pope's stance that were far more nuanced than headlines suggested. As Bondi calmly opened her portfolio and withdrew a sealed envelope bearing the Vatican's official insignia, a stunned silence fell over the room. This wasn't in anyone's prepared notes. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Bondi began, her voice measured and unwavering. Before I answer your question directly, I feel compelled to share something with this committee, something I was authorized to disclose only if the Pope's views were ever publicly misrepresented. AOC's expression shifted, her confidence giving way to wary anticipation. Around the room, lawmakers leaned in, sensing that the direction of the hearing was about to change in a way no one had expected. What I'm about to share isn't about politics, Bondi said calmly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the chamber. It's about truth. It's about nuance. And it's about the danger of distilling deeply moral and complex issues into empty sound bites, something I believe all of us, across the aisle, have been guilty of. As she delicately broke the seal on the Vatican-stamped envelope, the room held its breath. No one could have anticipated how what lay inside would momentarily pierce through the thick fog of partisanship that had defined American political discourse for decades. Nor could they have predicted that a congressional hearing, often the stage for combative grandstanding, was about to give way to one of the most authentic and human moments ever seen in that setting. With deliberate care, Bondi began removing the contents of the envelope, official documents, correspondence from the Vatican, proof of her private meeting with Pope Francis. But just as the weight of the moment began to land, Representative Ocasio-Cortez raised her hand. "Point of order, Mr. Chairman," she said firmly. "We have no means to verify the authenticity of these documents. This may be an attempt to deflect from the original question." Murmurs stirred through the room like wind across still water. Lawmakers whispered among themselves. Reporters typed furiously. Chairman Comer furrowed his brow, clearly blindsided by both Bondi's bold move and AOC's swift procedural counter. The scene was shifting rapidly, and everyone in the room could feel it. What had started as a routine immigration policy hearing had now shifted into a moment of national intrigue. When the committee reconvened, the tone in the chamber was unmistakably different, no longer routine political theater, but a room humming with anticipation. Independent authentication experts had verified the Vatican seal and signatures on Bondi's documents. A quick inquiry to the Vatican's press office yielded a carefully worded response. The Holy See neither confirmed nor denied the meeting, stating only that the Holy Father meets with numerous individuals, both publicly and privately, as part of his pastoral duties. When proceedings resumed, even Chairman Comer's tone had subtly shifted. "The committee has made a preliminary verification of the document's authenticity," he announced. "Miss Bondi, you may proceed, but I ask that your remarks remain concise and relevant to the hearing." Bondi placed the documents neatly on the table before her and leaned slightly forward. "3 months ago," she began, "I was invited to join a small humanitarian delegation at the Vatican to discuss the global migration crisis." She paused, then added, "Unlike official state visits, this meeting was kept confidential at the Pope's request. He wanted an open and honest dialogue, free from political grandstanding." She then held up a photograph, Bondi seated in the Pope's private library with 4 others. Pope Francis, unmistakable, sat beside her. The image was quietly passed to the committee aides. Over the course of 2 hours, Bondi continued, Pope Francis shared thoughts on immigration that the media rarely covers. His compassion for migrants is unwavering, but he also spoke candidly about the responsibilities of governments and the moral tension between open borders and national stability. Across the aisle, Representative Ocasio-Cortez adjusted in her seat, listening intently. Several Democratic members leaned toward each other, whispering, recalibrating their approach. And most relevant to today's hearing, Bondi added, lifting a page embossed with the Vatican letterhead, Pope Francis made a statement I was authorized to share, and I quote, "Nations have both the right and the duty to regulate migration in service to the common good of both citizens and migrants. Compassion without order can create greater suffering for the vulnerable." The room fell into a stunned silence, not of disbelief, but of reckoning. The narrative had shifted, and so had the ground beneath the committee's feet. The statement lingered in the air, unsettling the familiar narratives both parties had long used to define the Pope's position. It directly challenged the black-and-white assumptions of the immigration debate. On one side, Republican members looked quietly vindicated. On the other, several Democrats exchanged surprised glances, caught off guard by the complexity of the message. Sensing the shift in tone, Bondi pressed forward. "But before my Republican colleagues become too comfortable," she continued, "His Holiness also made it clear, border security must never come at the cost of human dignity. And wealthier nations, especially, carry a heightened moral responsibility toward those fleeing persecution." She flipped to the next page of the papal letter and read aloud, "The manner of enforcement reflects a nation's soul. Cruelty is never justified. Families must remain united. And those fleeing violence deserve particular care and attention." The room fell into a heavy, contemplative silence. This wasn't rhetoric. These weren't partisan talking points. These were words that forced reflection from both sides, words that neither party had been prepared to hear. After a long pause, Representative Dan Bishop of North Carolina finally broke the silence. "Ms. Bondi, if this meeting and message were so significant, why wasn't it made public sooner? Why wait until now?" Bondi's expression turned solemn. Her voice softened. "That," she said, "brings me to the hardest part of my testimony." She reached for a final document and gently laid it on the table. "Pope Francis requested that the meeting remain private," she explained. "He is deeply troubled by how his words have been weaponized by both political extremes. He authorized me to speak only if his views were mischaracterized in an official setting, and I believe that threshold was met today." Then she looked across the room at Representative Ocasio-Cortez. There was no trace of triumph in her eyes, only quiet sadness. "His Holiness is tired of being quoted selectively by people who have never taken the time to understand the fullness of his teaching." The hearing was no longer about scoring political points. It had become something more human, an invitation to listen beyond our filters, and perhaps, to understand. "He believes," Bondi began, her voice catching for the first time, "that political divisions are being placed above the truth, especially when it comes to matters that impact the most vulnerable." The room, already quiet, seemed to still further. Then, unexpectedly, Representative Jasmine Crockett, a Democrat from Texas, leaned forward and asked, "So you're saying Pope Francis is politically homeless? That neither side truly represents his views?" Bondi nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I'm saying, Congresswoman. And it's not limited to immigration." She turned to the final page of the papal letter, her fingers steady despite the weight of the moment. "His Holiness wrote something here that I believe will surprise all of us." Then, with clarity and reverence, Bondi read aloud words that would soon ripple far beyond the chamber walls. "I pray for the day when those who invoke my name in political debates would first sit with those they consider enemies, and listen with open hearts. The truth I follow is not owned by the left or the right, by progressives or conservatives. When you divide my words to serve your battles, you lose sight of the faces, the human faces, I seek to serve." The silence that followed was unlike anything typically heard in Congress. It wasn't the cold silence of strategy or calculation, it was the deep, uneasy quiet of shared reflection. Whatever had been expected from this hearing, it wasn't this. Not this mirror held up to the room, exposing how all sides had twisted a spiritual message for political gain. Then, as if on cue, the sound of a notification pinged from a phone. Then another. And another. Word was spreading fast. The Vatican press office had just released a public statement confirming the authenticity of Bondi's documents and her meeting with Pope Francis. They further announced that the Holy Father would personally address the issue during his Sunday Angelus prayer. What had started as yet another partisan clash had now evolved into something rare, something transformational. A moment that pierced through ideology and forced everyone, no matter their affiliation, to reconsider the assumptions they had brought into the room. As reporters rushed from the chamber to file their updates, no one yet knew that the most powerful moment was still on its way. The air in the hearing room felt charged, not with outrage or applause, but with something far more elusive in Washington, honest tension, and the quiet stirrings of introspection. This wasn't the usual partisan standoff. The tension in the room felt different, heavier, more human. For perhaps the first time in recent congressional memory, no one rushed to speak. No one scrambled for a soundbite. The usual performance of political posturing gave way to something quieter, more complex. Chairman Comer cleared his throat, casting a glance at both sides of the aisle before addressing the witness. "Ms. Bondi," he said slowly, "you've presented some unexpected information. But I'm still unclear on one point. You said the meeting with Pope Francis changed your own understanding. Could you explain how, specifically, his perspective has shaped your approach to border policy?" It was the perfect question. And Bondi knew it. She straightened slightly, inhaled deeply, and prepared to say something neither party in the room expected to hear. "Mr. Chairman," she began, "my meeting with Pope Francis didn't just clarify his stance. It fundamentally challenged mine." Her voice was calm and measured, but those who knew her best could hear something rare in it, vulnerability. The kind that doesn't come from weakness, but from confronting hard truths. "After our meeting," she continued, "His Holiness asked to speak with me alone. What I'm about to share, I've never told anyone. Not my staff. Not my colleagues." She paused, visibly moved, but composed. "The Pope didn't want to talk policy. He asked about my experiences at the border, not as an official, but as a human being. He wanted to know if I'd looked into the eyes of children in detention centers. If I had sat beside mothers who had fled unimaginable violence." The room fell completely still. "I told him the truth," she said quietly. "That I had kept my distance. That I had observed from the perimeter, maintaining a professional detachment." And then, for the first time, her voice trembled. "Pope Francis asked if I would join him in prayer. But not the kind of prayer I expected. He asked me to close my eyes," Bondi said softly, "and imagine my own nieces and nephews, the children he knew I adore, inside those same detention centers, fleeing those same horrors." She removed her glasses, the final layer of composure falling away. "I couldn't do it. I couldn't finish the prayer." Her voice cracked, and for a long moment, she simply let the silence hold. Then Pope Francis looked at me and said, "This is where policy begins, not with statistics or sovereignty, but with the ability to see ourselves in the vulnerable." Across the hearing room, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, who had been following Bondi's every word, quietly set down her pen. A small gesture, but one that rippled through the room. This was no longer political theater. Everyone could feel it. Something real was happening. "When I returned from Rome," Bondi continued, regaining her composure, "I requested an unannounced tour of 3 border facilities. No staff, no cameras, no briefings. Just me, seeing with new eyes." From her portfolio, she drew one last item, not a report or memo, but a child's drawing, done in crayon. It showed a smiling woman with yellow hair standing among children. She held it up. "This was given to me by Maria," she said, "an 8-year-old girl from Guatemala. She had been separated from her father for 42 days because of bureaucratic backlogs. Maria," she explained, "had been told by another child in detention that Bondi was important, that maybe she could help find her father." Bondi's voice broke completely. "I couldn't. The system I had spent years defending, believing it was necessary, was too slow, too rigid, too inhumane. All I could offer her was a hollow reassurance I didn't believe myself. The room was silent. Not the silence of politics, but of something heavier. Something sacred. Camera operators, sensing the gravity, zoomed in on the drawing, now appearing on screens across the country. "I've always believed you can be both compassionate and strong on border security," Bondi said. "And I still believe that. But my meeting with Pope Francis forced me to confront the places where rhetoric replaced reality, where policy became disconnected from the people it impacts most." She turned to face AOC directly. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you asked how I reconcile my faith with my immigration stance. The honest answer is imperfectly. With struggle. With humility. And now, with a renewed commitment to ensure that humanity never gets lost in policy." Then she did something no one in the chamber expected. "Which is why," she said, 2 weeks ago, I submitted to the president a comprehensive border reform proposal, one that maintains national security while directly addressing the humanitarian failures embedded in our current system." For a moment, there was no reaction. No applause. No rebuttal. Just stunned silence, a hearing room holding its breath. Because in a place so often defined by division and performance, something rare had occurred, a confession. A transformation. And a challenge to every person in the room to see the human faces behind the policies they debate. This proposal includes expedited processing for family units, strict limits on extended family separations, the implementation of trauma-informed care standards, and a significant increase in resources for asylum adjudication. She handed a stack of printed documents to the committee clerk for distribution. "This isn't about scoring political points," she added. "It's about doing what's right, for our national security and for the human beings seeking refuge within our borders." The first to respond was perhaps the most unexpected voice, Representative Rashida Tlaib, one of Congress's most vocal progressive figures. Her tone was unusually quiet. "Ms. Bondi," she asked gently, "may I ask, why didn't you publicize these revisions yourself? In this climate, most people hide that kind of evolution." Bondi gave a small nod, her answer calm but pointed. "Because Pope Francis asked me a question that I couldn't stop thinking about. Are you more interested in being right, or in getting it right?" She glanced down for a moment, then continued. "In politics, capital comes from appearing consistent, unwavering. But in real life, and I believe in effective governance, growth requires humility. It requires the courage to evolve when deeper understanding demands it." Then, something extraordinary happened. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, who had opened the hearing as Bondi's sharpest critic, slowly rose from her seat. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice level, "I'd like to request a brief recess to review Ms. Bondi's proposal before continuing with any further questioning." Chairman Comer looked up, visibly moved. "Without objection," he said. "Granted." As copies of Bondi's reform plan made their way around the room, something remarkable unfolded. Instead of retreating into partisan corners, members from both parties began huddling together, pointing to specific passages, exchanging ideas, even nodding in mutual recognition. It was no longer strategy, it was dialogue. 15 minutes later, the committee reconvened in a room that felt wholly different. Representative Ocasio-Cortez was the first to speak. Her tone had shifted completely. "Ms. Bondi," she began, carefully, "I'm sure there are elements of your proposal I'll critique upon closer review. But before we get to that, I want to acknowledge something." She paused, choosing her words with care. "What you've shared today represents something that feels nearly impossible in today's political culture, the willingness to be transformed by encounter, rather than entrenched in ideology." Bondi's eyes shimmered, and for a brief moment, so did AOC's. Two women, once cast as adversaries, now stood as examples of something greater, the power of empathy, humility, and human connection to shift even the hardest of lines. "Thank you, Representative," Bondi said, her voice steady but full of feeling. "That means more than you know." Chairman Comer, visibly aware of the historical weight of the moment unfolding before him, spoke with rare sincerity. "Perhaps there's a lesson here for all of us," he said. "Not just about immigration, but about how we approach every divisive issue with greater humility and respect." The cameras captured a scene few could have predicted at the start of the hearing: genuine human connection, forged across political lines, sparked by the moral clarity of a spiritual leader and the vulnerability of a public servant brave enough to change in front of the entire nation. As the hearing adjourned, members from both parties gathered around Bondi, not for performative handshakes or soundbites, but for what looked like sincere, meaningful conversations. Journalists in the gallery later described an extraordinary sight: lawmakers from opposite ends of the political spectrum quietly agreeing to hold private, off-the-record discussions on immigration reform. What began as another partisan showdown had transformed into something far deeper, a rare triumph of humanity over politics. A moment when the masks of ideology briefly slipped, revealing a shared desire to align law with conscience, policy with principle. It wasn't just Bondi's disclosure about Pope Francis that moved the room, it was the broader revelation that transformation through honest, empathetic encounter was still possible, even in the hardened halls of Washington. The impact of what came to be known as the Bondi revelation spread quickly beyond Capitol Hill. Within hours, video clips of the hearing had gone viral, amassing millions of views and igniting public discourse that broke through usual partisan silos. Cable news panels found themselves unexpectedly aligned. Conservative commentators, who had prepared to defend Bondi's traditional policies, instead praised the moral courage it took to evolve in full public view. Progressive analysts, who had expected to denounce religious hypocrisy, now reflected on the risks of selectively weaponizing the words of faith leaders. Across the spectrum, the message was clear: real change doesn't come from shouting points, it comes from the quiet, difficult decision to listen, reflect, and grow. And on that day, for one brief and extraordinary moment, America got to witness what that looked like. "I've been covering Congress for 27 years, said veteran CNN correspondent Gloria Borger, and I can't recall a moment of such raw, bipartisan vulnerability. Whatever happens next in terms of policy, something fundamental shifted in that hearing room." The Vatican's response came swiftly. Speaking before tens of thousands gathered in St. Peter's Square, and millions more watching around the world, Pope Francis addressed the matter directly during his Sunday Angelus prayer. "This week, a private conversation I had with a public servant became public knowledge," he began, his voice resonating across the plaza. "While I usually prefer such dialogues remain private, I am deeply moved that Ms. Bondi did not use our exchange as political ammunition, but rather as an invitation to deeper self-reflection." Then, in words that echoed far beyond the Vatican walls, he added, "We live in a time when many seek to place me, and the Church, on one side of a political divide. But the Church stands with truth and with human dignity, which no political ideology can fully contain. When we truly encounter one another across differences, as happened in that hearing room, we glimpse what reconciliation might look like in our fractured world." Back in Washington, the impact was immediate. Just 3 days after the hearing, a bipartisan coalition of 12 lawmakers, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans, announced the formation of a working group to draft a new immigration reform package, using key elements of Bondi's proposal as a foundation. "There will be no cameras, no press releases during our process," declared Representative Henry Cuellar, a moderate Democrat from Texas. "What Ms. Bondi showed us is that real progress only happens when we create space for personal evolution, without fear of political backlash." Standing beside him, Republican Representative Tony Gonzalez added, "This isn't about meeting in the middle, it's about honestly addressing all sides: security, humanity, process, and resources. And building real solutions from there." For Pam Bondi, the response was as complex as it was powerful. She received praise across the aisle, but also criticism, particularly from hardline immigration opponents. Some accused her of caving to emotion. A sharply worded Wall Street Journal op-ed questioned whether tears in a hearing room should dictate national security. But those voices were increasingly isolated. A CBS News poll conducted just 1 week after the hearing found that 72% of Americans described Bondi's testimony as courageous, including 68% of Republicans and 65% of Democrats. A rare moment of national consensus. More than just a policy discussion, Bondi's testimony had ignited a broader cultural conversation about moral growth in public life. Major publications published features examining historic figures who had undergone deep ideological shifts, from Abraham Lincoln's evolving views on race to Senator Robert Byrd's transformation from segregationist to civil rights advocate. "We've built a political culture where consistency is prized above growth," wrote David Brooks in the New York Times. The Bondi moment challenges us to ask whether we want leaders who never change, or leaders who remain open to deeper understanding. In the weeks that followed, the Immigration Working Group made cautious but steady progress. Comprehensive reform remained elusive in a divided Congress, but the group succeeded in passing 2 targeted bipartisan bills, one to reduce family separations, and another to expedite processing for asylum seekers. 2 months after her testimony, Bondi was invited back to the Vatican, this time for a public audience with Pope Francis. Photos of their meeting, Francis clasping her hands warmly, both visibly emotional, graced the front pages of newspapers around the world. "Ms. Bondi has shown what I hope to see in all public servants," the Pope told reporters afterward. "Not perfect alignment with my views, that is neither possible nor necessary, but the willingness to encounter the other, to see the human face behind policy, and to grow more merciful because of that encounter." For many Americans, the lasting legacy of Bondi's testimony didn't lie in legislative details. It lived in the emotional clarity she had brought to a broken process. In town halls and community forums across the country, a new question began to surface. Would you, like Pam Bondi, be willing to share a time when your views evolved, after truly encountering the people affected by your decisions? Some politicians deflected. Others answered uncomfortably. But for once, voters weren't asking for perfection. They were asking for honesty. And for a brief, unforgettable moment in Washington, they got it. While some lawmakers responded with carefully crafted, focus-grouped answers, a surprising number embraced the challenge. They shared real, personal stories of change, moments where their views had evolved through direct experience. It was a ripple effect that sociologist Robert Putnam would later describe as small tears in the fabric of polarization. 6 months after that now historic congressional hearing, a documentary titled The Bondi Effect premiered to national attention. The film featured voices from across the ideological spectrum, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, who had been inspired by Bondi's testimony to reach across political divides. The documentary followed grassroots initiatives taking root in unexpected places, immigration discussion circles in churches, student forums on college campuses, and community centers where progressive activists and border enforcement advocates sat together, face to face. These weren't debates, they were conversations grounded in Pope Francis's call to encounter before argument. At a Georgetown University forum on faith and public life, Bondi gave her final public remarks on the matter. She reflected not on policy points or legislative wins, but on the deeply personal nature of what her testimony had become. "People often ask me if I regret being so vulnerable in such a public setting," she told the audience. "The truth is, I had no idea that moment would resonate the way it did. I wasn't trying to spark a movement or make headlines." She paused, then added, "I was simply trying, imperfectly, to honor both my conscience and Pope Francis's challenge, to place truth above political advantage, and to allow my humanity to lead, even in the most public of places."